Welcome to Homicide Life on the Set, a podcast about the Emmy Award-winning television show Homicide Life on the Street, with myself, Chris Carr, and Susan Ingram. On today's podcast, we're joined by Ted Bogosian and Richard Chisolm. They're the filmmakers behind the PBS documentary Anatomy of a Homicide, Life on the Street. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Homicide Life on the Set. We have a very, very interesting episode today because we're going to be looking at behind the scenes of the documentary Anatomy of a Homicide, Life on the Street, which was directed by Ted Bogosian and was shot by Richard Chisolm. And Susan, how are you doing?
Good. Yeah, I agree. This is a really interesting episode, and I think I say in the conversation, I love all these layers.
Yes, we've gone behind the scenes of behind the scenes. Yeah.
You know, we look at the show. This is the documentary looking at the show, and then we're doing a podcast looking at the documentary looking at the show. I love that.
Yeah, very, very meta. But no, fantastic episode today. I mean, both Ted and Richard are very accomplished filmmakers. So we do obviously primarily talk about their work on the documentary about homicide, but we do sort of talk about their other work as well. And Ted, he was the first director since the Kennedy administration to get behind-the-scenes access at the White House. And he talks us a little bit about his PBS documentary that then went on to inspire an episode of The West Wing, not The West Wing itself.
Right, episode. The press secretary, which was the documentary.
That's it. I believe it's in season 4 of West Wing, but there we go. So, so we're on our second year of podcasting, which is fantastic. We've already recorded quite a few interviews of some really great guests coming up. We'll keep it a secret for now, just to keep the surprise element there. But we did just want to quickly say a huge thank you to our listeners around the world. We've got quite an eclectic list of people around the world who are listening to us. We don't know who they are individually, but we know which country they're in and sometimes which city.
Shout out.
So we've
Shout
got
out to them, yeah.
Yeah. So we have listeners obviously in the United States, the United Kingdom, which is fantastic. Then we have listeners in Canada, Australia, Ireland, Singapore, Japan, Sweden, Romania. We also have listeners in New Zealand, Argentina, Thailand, Spain, Italy. We've also got some listeners in Iraq, Croatia, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Lithuania, and Jamaica. So
I love that.
Thank you very much to all of you out there who are listening to us in all these exotic places. I would love to come to Jamaica one day, so whoever is listening to that, please drop me an email.
Drop us a line and meet us at the airport, right? It's just
I'll happily do a homicide episode on the beach in Jamaica.
It's just amazing. It shows you the reach of, as my brother calls it, the interwebs, you know, that people... You know, if it was just a radio show, it would have a local, you know, maybe national reach at night when the radio waves could get farther. But to have listeners all around the globe in some very remote areas is really heartening. And thank you, everybody out there. Thank you to everyone who's been listening, because we have really just been enjoying the heck out of this. And I think have been bringing some really, you know, just some really entertaining, but also informative background information about what it's like to be filmmakers, what it was like working on the show. And this episode, particularly, what it's like to be a documentary filmmaker and their backstories on why they became documentary filmmakers and how dedicated they are to the truth, was just really a fascinating conversation. So big props to Ted and Richard for coming on with us to talk to us. And I would encourage, because we can't give everybody's whole resumes, I would encourage everybody who listens to our podcast to get onto imdb.com, which for those who don't know what that is, although who knows why nobody knows what that is the Internet Movie Database. And just search their names and look at their amazing backgrounds, the amazing amount of work, and you know the scope of people's work, and then follow their work too. Like look at the actors and directors and other crew people that we worked with. Go look and see what else they've worked on. Really an amazing group of people we've been talking to. So it has been an amazing first year. And yeah, welcome to the second year. And what an interesting topic to start with for season 2. I love it. I love it. I just wanted to give 2 shout outs early in the documentary. In addition to Richard, who was the cinematographer for this documentary, Michael Griffith was also a cinematographer on the documentary, and Dennis Towns. Shout out to Dennis. Also went to college with him. Dennis and Richard were best friends in college. Dennis was the sound mixer on this documentary. So just wanted to let people know that before we listen. So Ted Bogosian is an Emmy award-winning filmmaker and television producer, and he's been directing, producing, and writing long-form documentaries since 1978 and collaborating with the Levinson Fontana Company. Since he did this documentary, that became the best connection for him between that. And he did do some dramatic work after working with us on the documentary about the subway episode. And he's won top prizes from the National Press Club to the Chicago Film Festival to the Writers Guild of America. And Richard, also Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker and cinematographer, over 35 years of production experience, based here in Baltimore, shot films and television programs on a wide variety of subjects in the U.S. and abroad, and is deeply committed to the value of real stories and the adventures of real people, and also has the background of PBS, National Geographic, BBC, Discovery Channel, HBO, and many others. So, please go look up their full resumes, because really, 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 these guys are really impressive filmmakers.
Indeed. No, they're totally blown away by them. Ted's background and Richard's and their philosophy was just really great to listen to. One other thing that's really cool is we have been listed as one of the 100 best Baltimore podcasts in FeedSpot, and FeedSpot's a website that kind of collects podcasts and categorizes them by subject. And so we had the honor of being included in the top 100, and currently we're at number 45. So thank you very much for FeedSpot, and thank you everybody for listening. It's obviously based on listener numbers and the connection to Baltimore that kind of gets us into that chart in the first place. So thank you everybody involved with that.
Woo-hoo,
but that's pretty cool, I thought.
Thank you.
So nice to be connected to Baltimore itself.
And thanks to people out there. Apparently we're rated at some level of 5 stars on Apple Play.
Oh, amazing.
I think it said that
thank
on
you
the
so much for
FeedSpot
positive
listing.
reviews.
So thanks for people that are posting reviews.
Yeah. And also, one thing I've noticed, everybody who does contact us or leaves comments is always, very positive and very enthusiastic. So thank you very much. We do appreciate that. And I know there are some of you who share our episodes on the various Facebook groups like the Waterfront, etc. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Shout out to the Waterfront group. Absolutely.
Yeah. Big shout out, and have to do another trip to Baltimore at some point in the future. Probably next year, because I don't think I could afford it this year, unless our Patreon numbers go through the roof or something. But no, next year, return to Baltimore.
maybe we'll do a Homicide Life on the Set reunion.
We should. So I'll get everybody
throw
who's
our
on the
own
show.
reunion and just say, hey, everybody show up at Cooper's. We won't do any kind of organization like Stephanie.
See what happens.
And Greer and Kathy did. Just show up there, okay?
Excellent.
And buy a beer for Patrick.
So without further ado, let's jump into the episode, and we will catch you on the other side. Thank you for listening. Today we have Ted and Richard, who are the two men behind Anatomy of a Homicide, which is a fantastic documentary. It looks at the making of the episode from season 6 called Subway. So welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you both on.
Hey, you guys. I thought this would be a great way. You are, by the way, kicking off our second year, which I can't believe I'm saying second year. We've been doing this. And I thought when Richard actually suggested it, I've known Richard for 100 years from college. Richard suggested maybe we'd like to do an episode on this. And I thought, what a great, so we're already doing a podcast that looks at how Homicide was made And now we're looking at the documentary about how Homicide was made. We're talking to the guys that made the documentary about how Homicide was made. So I love that sort of the multiple self-reflexiveness, the self-reflexiveness of it. So yeah, welcome. So let's just jump in. So starting with Ted, what is your background and your pathway to, and this is a long question, but your pathway to making documentaries? And I have found out from reading parts of Richard's book, what his sort of, how it shook out for him that he became more focused on documentary filmmaking. So what was your path, and what compelled you more to documentaries than dramatic films? Although I know that you do both, that you're involved in both.
Well, thank you for having me. I was in graduate school at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard in the class of 79. And over the summer, there was an internship at WGBH, the Boston Public Television Station. So I took that, and then Nova invited me to become an associate producer. So I was on the staff at WGBH for 9 years, making documentaries about science and technology and public policy. And it was wonderful because I had a budget, I had a job, I had a straight line to broadcast, and I ended up making about 15 documentaries there, and then formed my own company in '86 and continued to make independent documentaries for public television and the New York Times and others. So I always gravitated toward fact, and I think that only after the Homicide documentary did I start to produce and direct some fiction.
Oh, that's interesting. And I have later on, I want to ask about how that connection continued with you between Tom Fontana and Barry Levinson. But Richard, why don't you jump in there and give us your background and what compelled you to sort of focus more in your career on documentaries?
I was an artist as a kid, and in some fluky kind of situation, my older brother gave me a Super 8 camera when I was like 15, and me and my friends got together and started making silly films. And so by the time I graduated from high school, I went to film school immediately. I didn't think twice, and there was a film school right near me. That's where I met Susan. Actually, we were at this sort of young university that had a great film program and great equipment and stuff. And so I never looked back. Like I said, when I was 16 years old to my parents, I'm going to be a filmmaker. And I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew that that's what it was. And so so then I went to college. I started working on films, taking classes. And then as students, we were able to sometimes kind of go off and be PAs on shoots, documentaries, features, commercials, whatever. And I just loved it all. I loved cameras. And so as students, you produce films. I produced and I directed and co-produced a documentary as my senior project in college, and it ended up getting on PBS nationally, half-hour documentary. And that was like this, this brain thing went off. This is the right thing. So then I worked in the film department. Susan worked in the film department. I stayed an extra year because I was having fun being on the university. And then I went freelance completely, I think in 1982. And I never have had a real job since. So in the first 8 years, I did camera work, but also on other days, assistant camera work. And I worked on commercials and feature films that would come through Baltimore and documentaries. And as I grew up and became more mature and wise, I think at age 30-something, I started realizing that when I work on documentaries, I was happiest. And when I worked on movies or TV shows that were fictional, I enjoyed being there and doing it, but when I walked away from it, I was like, because other than Homicide and The Wire, which I had the privilege of working on, I never was very proud of working on some dumbass, car chase movie or something. I never talked to my neighbors about it. So I realized this thing went off when I was in my 30s, is like documentaries where I'm most focused. And I also started working with Ted around that time first, I think on a Nova, and then on some of his other independent documentaries. And he's like the ideal producer director for me because I could complement his interest in content and interest in fact and in truth. and just real people in their lives and stuff. So I continued to work on narrative stuff occasionally, but mostly documentary.
Yeah, if I might say one more thing.
Yeah, go jump in, Ted.
I was listening to NPR over the weekend, and there was an Irish author who quoted Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his thoughts about journalism, which was the most amazing passage. He wrote, "In journalism, just one fact that is false prejudices the entire work. In contrast, in fiction, one single fact that is true gives legitimacy to the entire work." And I thought that was absolutely positively true. And I think that's something that Richard really understands and appreciates too. And that's why I loved working with him.
Wow, that's a great way to look at it. And how did you two, I know Richard worked with us on Homicide, on the B camera fairly often. How did the connection come, with you? Obviously, Ted, you were already, and do you go by Ted or Teddy? What do you want me to call you?
Teddy. My friends call me Teddy. People who don't know me call me Ted. So Ted was my dad.
I'll call you Teddy then. I'll do that. So what was the connection? How did it come about? How did you get connected with Barry and Tom and/or NBC? Did you take them the idea? Did somebody come to you?
I was sitting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on a Sunday night during the Super Bowl in 1993. I was running a television series out there for the public television station about the future of space exploration. And it was a lousy game. The Cowboys were playing the Buffalo Bills, I want to say. And they were running spots for this new NBC series that was going to be premiering after the Super Bowl in that coveted spot, which was Homicide. And I looked at it. It was black and white, some of it. There were triple jump cuts, a lot of handheld 16 millimeter. And I was completely fascinated by that. So I watched the show and I was completely bowled over. And over the course of the next couple of years, I went to some Writers Guild events in New York, and I saw Tom talking about Homicide serendipitously. And around, I guess, 1995, I started talking to WGBH about producing an independent documentary about the making of an episode of network television, which I knew completely nothing about. And they said, "Well, what are you thinking?" And I had some ideas. And gradually, I took them the idea of Homicide. And they said, "Well, if you can get access, let us know." So then I started talking to Tom. And I went down to Chelsea Piers and pitched him. And I'm not even sure he looked at any of my previous work. But he was intrigued. And after a little more time went by, we kind of agreed to agree. So then I took it back to PBS, who said, "Look, what we're really interested in is not only the making of this, but also securing the broadcast of whatever episode it turns out to be." And that was another trick, getting into it. But everyone was enamored of Homicide. Everyone admired it. Everyone liked the pedigree with Levinson Fontana. And they liked the documentary Link. But of course, many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, right? So then I find myself in the summer of 97 getting ready to shoot.
Wow. And what an episode to have ended up landing on to film the behind the scenes of.
Yeah, and did they choose that, or did it just happen to be the one that was coming into pre-production? Or it's really interesting that it was that episode, which is an atypical Homicide episode.
Yeah, a bottle episode. And what I've come to realize is that it's a real-time episode. So that when that is embedded in the documentary, you're not only seeing an episode of Homicide commercial-free for the first time, but you're seeing a real-time episode that takes place without commercial interruptions. So that's a really unique and wonderful viewing opportunity because of the real-time nature of the script.
Right. And they even discussed that in the part of the documentary where, I guess it was you guys, had you gone to Levinson's place outside San Francisco for the story meeting, where they actually talk about, the guy's going to be alive maybe, 20, 40 minutes. And I think I think Barry says, how about 46 minutes? So that it really puts the bookends on the fact that this was actually happening within the time frame of the actual show's running time, which is interesting.
Right. Well, before that, I went down and I met Jim in a bar in Fells Point one morning, and we had a wonderful conversation. And then I got a call, I think, from Tom Fontana a few days later saying, Jim doesn't want to be in the documentary. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the documentary.
Yoshimura?
Yeah.
Really? Yoshimura said that. Oh my gosh. And it's so really vital part of it.
I'm not sure whether it was an offer or a command, but Tom was very persuasive.
Command. I'll step in and say, I bet it was a command.
And then 2 months later, we had that moment in Ross outside San Francisco at Barry's place where we were in the writer's room. And I think that was really a test drive to sort of see how intrusive we were going to be and what was our style going to be. And so we kind of passed that. And then a couple of months later, we found ourselves in pre-production in Baltimore.
And what was your connection? Had you worked together? You and Richard worked together? You said Novas and things. So how did that come about?
Well, we had recently worked on a 1996 film that was the hour leading up to the vice presidential debate. And Richard and I started working together at Georgetown, where we had some politicians and candidates come in, and that went really well. So it just kind of blossomed.
It was a documentary about the vice presidency, the history of it, and the idea of it.
Right. And you had so the Subway episode was season 6. So you had already worked with us a number of times prior to that. He would come in on
second season. I started working as a day player, either second unit or second camera.
Right. Top rate the B camera. And I got to jump up on the B camera with him at the time. So then, wow, that's really interesting. So it was sort of happenstance that it became the Subway episode that you guys were going to follow us around, or not necessarily follow. We didn't go anywhere. You didn't have to follow us. You were just right.
Well, of course, it almost wasn't the Subway episode because they weren't sure until the very last minute whether they were going to get access to the subway for a location.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So I remember there were some conversations that didn't make it into the documentary, although Jim Finnerty poses the question to Yoshimura in a meeting. He says, well, what would happen if you didn't get the subway? And there were some conversations on the side about, well, maybe it would be someone who was in an automobile accident and got trapped underneath a car or a truck, or maybe there was someone who was going to be on the water and he was going to, but it wouldn't have worked. It just simply would not have worked.
Right. Because that situation, it was a given that the person would not survive being pulled up,
Correct.
Once they lifted the train.
That's right.
Right.
When you were filming the story meeting in San Francisco, I'm assuming other episodes are talked about as well. So was there another episode you may have ended up filming if it wasn't Subway?
No. I remember being excused from some of the meeting, which I was happy to do, to cooperate. And they were talking about the arc of the whole season, which was frankly none of my business. So I want to say by that time, Yash had agreed to participate, and then we didn't know how things were going to work out in Baltimore in the subway, who was going to direct and who was going to star. They were casting about for a John Lang character early on, and I'll get to that whenever you're ready. But there was a very famous African American actor who they coveted for that role. And I teach at Brown and at Duke filmmaking, and I use the documentary and the script and the call sheet and even some dailies to show people how episodic drama is made. And the most interesting thing about it is we talk about, well, what if Samuel L. Jackson, for example, had played John Lang? Then all of those scenes between Pemberton, Andre Braugher, and Samuel L. Jackson, John Lang, would have been completely different than had it been Vincent D'Onofrio, who, of course, it was. And so it's really kind of fascinating to think about how the chips fell.
Yeah, that would have completely changed the dynamic between their characters and their initial trust and their initial comfort with each other and everything. Yeah, that's interesting. So like you mentioned earlier, we obviously had restrictions, and I don't know if it's MTA or MDOT who runs the subway, and from the Transportation Administration on what we could and couldn't do, and it was very tight with where the trains, where we could shoot. The initial scene of him going into the subway is at a different subway stop, was at President Street Station, and then we shot from midnight or from the time the subways closed, 11 p.m. or something, until dawn, which was at the underground stop in front of Hopkins, the original Hopkins Hospital campus. So we had all kinds of restrictions happening. What kinds of things? What were you told? You can't do this. You can't do that. You can. I've been on sets before where the director says, "Get the damn documentary crew away from me." I mean, there's got to be. Well, as documentarians, you come into those situations a lot where you have to be very careful about how you approach things and approach people and approach locations and all that. But what was this? What was the dynamic with Homicide and what kind of access and how you were welcomed or rebuffed, or how did that work? Because we were in our own chaos, in that subway station. But it sounds like, oh, subway station, that's a lot of room. Well, when you have 100 extras in the crew, it was very tense, close, hot, because it was the middle of the summer, and chaotic. So how did you handle that? And what kinds of things did you have to, work under? And you too, Richard, for how you get the camera around and how you work maybe with Alex. Is he going to talk to you about the lighting or not? Or do you just catch can? How did that work?
Well, we had a 4-person team, myself, an associate producer, a cinematographer, and sound. And because it was so chaotic down there in the subway, which is where we started the production on day one, we were just part of the chaos. And my MO was to ask for forgiveness and not permission. So we just started rolling and figured, well, maybe there could have been a news crew down there, or maybe it just was part of the scenery, right? As long as I wasn't in the shot and we didn't see a boom in the shot. So no one said anything to us. But I will say that from the beginning, there was a lot of reluctance on the part of the director to have us shoot this, because he was going to be under a ton of pressure, not only because of the weather, not only because of the location, not only because of the time of day, but it was a very tough script to deliver. It was more like a stage play, and there was a triangle that was set up between John Lang and Pemberton, and then the EMT flanked on the other side. So Alex Zakshevsky had to get very creative and figure out how to deal with Andre and Vincent, and make something out of this. Really with camera movement and with performance, especially, pulling performances out of people at that hour in those conditions was a very, very hard thing to do. So, having a cinematographer looking over his shoulder all the time, and also trying to pull people out to do interviews throughout the production, it wasn't optimal for him. And to his credit, he allowed us to continue. But as you can tell from watching the documentary, there are moments of stress that we captured that reveal that.
Were a lot of the principals in your documentary, like the director, etc., were they wired for sound when you were filming? Because there are moments you pick up really great tidbits of conversation.
No, only Yoshimura had a wireless.
Okay.
We didn't put a wireless on anyone else for technical reasons and also for political reasons and creative reasons. But there is the one scene where it's in the middle of the night and Alex Zakshevsky is complaining to Yash about the director and the director's complaining to Yash about the cinematographer. But, we pulled some of our typical tricks. Richard will talk to you about this, I'm sure, where we turned off the tally light and walked away from the camera after we framed it wide. So no one knew we were rolling at the time. But Yash had his wireless on and didn't switch that off. And we were able to get that moment.
Yeah, that's a great moment because I think without that moment, the whole thing would lose some of the reality of how difficult that shoot was and how physically and mentally difficult it was for everyone. I know Vince D'Onofrio his performance is amazing for what he had to go through, and he was incredibly uncomfortable and tense for much of that. So that performance is crazy. But that moment, and tell us how you did that, Richard, that moment that you capture with Alex saying, like he's saying, we get the shot set up, we're ready, and then Gary would come and tap him on the shoulder and ask him to do something else, and it was really making Alex very tense. But then that little exchange between the two of them, where Yash says, "Okay, so he's driving you nuts. Do you want me to talk to him, or do you want to talk to him?" And Alex is like, "You talk to him," Yeah. But I love the fact that the hot mic was on. And that you went over and he takes Gary's side and has a little bit of a conversation with him. That is one of the super, super really down to earth, real moments about how difficult it is in many situations, any kind of filmmaking. But that was great that you did that. So tell us your secret of how you got that.
So
Richard,
I have to add an aside here, which is that when the schedule for the episode was floating around on the calendar, and I was involved with Ted early on in the planning of this thing and talking about it, and when it landed in the calendar of the subway shoot, which was 8 days long or something, it was the 8 days that I had tickets to go to Europe to be away. So I was not in the subway production area. A great camera guy that Ted
oh
knew
really?
and had worked
That wasn't
with.
you?
No. So Ted.
That's how bad my memory is.
That's all right. So Ted knew this guy, Michael Griffith, who he'd worked with before, a California-based cinematographer.
Okay, hello, Michael Griffith. Hello, we should have talked to you too. Sorry.
And he did this fantastic job of the very hectic production scenes that I was not present. Unfortunately, I was heartbroken, and the only thing that saved me from being just dramatically disappointed to not be there during that shoot is when I talked to Ted later when I came back from Europe, and Ted said it was really difficult, Richard. It was like,
well, the truth is that we shot Beta SP. It was before HD, and after the first night of production, I came back to my room in Fells Point, and I replayed the Beta. And it was a mess. It was a royal mess. And I thought, I don't have a movie. How can I possibly capture what's going on? There are 100 extras flying all around. What about the stunt? How are we going to be able to present how that was? I was distraught. I was completely distraught after the first day. And then once the stunt was accomplished and the whole episode was going to hang on that, there was a rhythm that began to develop, and everyone sort of got into the flow, and it went very smoothly from that point on.
So when you were behind them, when Yoshimura was having that discussion with Alex, the cameraman just, because the camera was, I thought the camera, you said, so you turned the light off so nobody knows you're recording.
Right.
And did he put it down? I mean, how?
No, it was on sticks.
Oh, it was on sticks. Okay.
It was a wide shot from about 30 feet away. And we weren't monitoring the audio. Maybe Dennis Towns was, but probably he was. But Dennis knew we were rolling, and I sort of gave him a sign that we were rolling, and he turned over, and then it just went on. So I didn't know what we had until I got back the next day and played it back.
What was the procedure when they discovered this conversation was about to happen? What, was it you, or was it the sound guy said, "Hang on, there's an argument about to happen"?
No, it's a sixth sense that you develop. Richard knows this too. From being on documentaries for so long, you can't will something to happen. Sometimes you can, but you can certainly be prepared for it to happen. And so I had just come off this America's Cup documentary where Michael Griffith and I were on yachts, racing yachts in San Diego. And we had developed a rapport where it was a two-boat race, and it was a trial in the afternoon, and it was the U.S. against the French, and we were on the U.S. boat, and it went on and on and on, and I kept rolling and rolling because I knew the skipper was going to crash his boat. I absolutely positively knew it from knowing what I know about sports and teamwork. And so we had to be on the water for 3 hours before he crashed his boat. But because we didn't give up, we got the moment. And a lot of times, Richard will tell you this too. If you capture a moment like that, you can hang your whole movie on it.
Wow. And so this, you wrote, directed, and produced this, Ted.
Yes.
Is that your normal thing?
Yes.
Making films, you do everything basically. I mean, not everything, but you know what I mean. Or was this different?
No, this was the same. I write the treatment. I produce it. Make sure it happens. Raise the money. Put the team together. Go to the location. Direct on location. Come back. Sit with an editor. In this case, it was Dick Bartlett, who did an amazing job. I mean, it's just a fabulous.
It's so editing. Well put together. It really is.
He's brilliant. Dick is a long time, 40, 50-year experience editor of many long-form documentaries for public television. And he's the kind of guy where I've been working with him since 1986, and I'll just have a conversation with him about what I think the movie's about and go away for 3 or 4 weeks, and he'll come back and show me a cut. And then I'll write the narration stings that fit in.
So prior to, and I need to say that I have a lot of people who, like we talked about earlier, who don't remember Homicide, who weren't born yet, who whatever, don't know why is it such a big deal. Well, now I'm going to tell people, go watch the documentary about why and you'll learn why it's such a big deal, because you talk about the whole history of how the show started, how difficult it became in the middle, where they wanted to keep up with production because they knew what a quality show it was, but we weren't getting the ratings, and we're losing to Nash Bridges in 2020, and you know, we were always worried about getting canceled, and all that stuff. But where was that question going? I don't know.
Well, let me say that the second season of Homicide, as you remember, was only 4 episodes.
Right.
Because NBC couldn't figure out what to do with it. And it never got out of the Friday night at 10 time slot, which is a graveyard time slot. That's where shows go to die. So somehow it ended up staying on the air for, what was it, 7 years, I think?
7, yeah. So I remembered my question. So my question was, the documentary covers pre-production, where they're writing Jim's writing the script, they're finalizing the script, he's getting the notes from Tom and from NBC. Those are all incorporated, and then the prep, where the director gets to walk through the location prep, and the technical crew gets to come through. What were you doing? Were you writing prior to that? Do you write as you're shooting it and things occur? Like, one of the opening lines I loved so much was when you said, "This is a story of risk, ambition, and creativity under pressure." That was like such a great sort of distillation of filmmaking in general, but this specific episode too, and also your story of how the documentary is made, is also about risk, ambition, and creativity under pressure. So there's like many layers of that. So are you writing those lines later? Are you writing the narration later? Or are these kinds of things coming to you as you're working?
Well, I scribble some ideas as I'm working every day, because I conducted all the interviews. So you see Yash, and you see Vincent, and you see Anya Epstein, you see Julie Martin. And so, we're either on the set doing that in the box, or we're doing that in the middle of the night on location during lunch, whatever. So I have to sort of have those questions be a sort of roadmap to my ultimate narration, because when I'm walking away, that's what I got. And if I get 10 minutes with Gary Fleeter on the day, or if I get 10 minutes with Vincent, I have to make the most of that. So I have to have some idea what this is all about. And I actually use that first night or day, rather, of fear after the first day shooting to kind of fuel myself to make some choices, some creative choices. Because you're right, I was under a ton of pressure. I had raised a lot of money for this from PBS, and if it didn't happen, it was going to be my fault. And so all along there were moments, forks in the road, you might say, where I got lucky. So what if Warren Littlefield? By the way, when I went to interview Warren Littlefield in Los Angeles, on the day, they said, well, Warren doesn't want to do this anymore.
Oh, no. On the day.
So,
the day of.
So I had on the day, I had my crew, and we were waiting in LA to do this and yeah. So there's a lot of kind of begging and cajoling and saying, well, here we are, that we're on a tight budget, we're on a tight schedule, whatever it happens to be. And most of the time, as Richard will attest, we're persuasive, but sometimes we're not. And that was at a time when documentary was still a sort of, let me say, poor relation to drama.
Still is.
And back when we started in the 80s and 90s especially, a lot of documentary producers wanted to work in drama and felt that they hadn't made it, or they wouldn't make it until they worked in drama. I never felt that. And I think it's certainly different now. There's a lot of luster that happens when people who are working in drama cross over and work in documentary. Everyone's got their series or their show, whatever it happens to be. And there also used to be a firewall between the editorial and the network. But now, you watch documentaries and you practically assume that anyone who's in the documentary is going to get an end credit as a co-producer, an executive producer, a writer. And it used to be that was an absolute taboo, and now it's completely permissible, if not encouraged.
Interesting.
One random question, just out of interest. The on-set interviews you got, because you talk about the complications and having to make certain decisions. Can you remember what day of the sort of schedule those on-set interviews were done? Because you've got some with Andre and Clark Johnson. It looks like it's kind of looks like it's where the ticket lobby is. And then you've got some with Yosh, which looks like it's sort of in a tunnel. And you've also got Vincent on that day as well. When were those interviews sort of done?
They were all done during lunch. That was the only time that I could pull anybody away. And you'll notice there's a B story and there's a C story. It's not just John Lang being stuck in the subway, but then there's Biedron and Bayless, sort of dealing with his ID and his background in Chicago and all that. And then the C story is Falzone and Lewis trying to find the woman, John Lang's
the girlfriend,
right? So there's not a lot of coverage because we had to work all night in the subway, and so we had to worry about what we were going to be doing the next day or the next night, and so even though we went out with them a little bit in the afternoon, it was mostly overnight that we did our interviews. And I want to say, I think with Anya and Julie, it might have happened the day after we wrapped, or the episode
wrapped. In the box, I think.
Right, because those were in the box.
They were in the box, yeah.
So also a couple of those interviews, I think the one with Andre and maybe the one with Vince, but maybe it was with Clark. There are some shots of you interviewing them.
Right.
So you see the camera and the back of your head. So there's another camera. So here we are with another layer. So who was that?
We hanged that camera high and wide behind me, just to give a different view. I think that was even a small format camera. It wasn't a Beta SP. the resolution is not very high on that camera.
It fit in nicely with that MTV aesthetic from that period of documentaries.
True.
You're so right, Chris. That's absolutely right. That's where we were going with that. One thing I like to do, and Richard's great at this, and why I like to work with him so much, I like there to be different kinds of filmmaking within one of my films. So there are some verite scenes. There are some more traditional setups. There's some archival that we use. I like to vary the visual diet in the film and not just have it be one particular genre.
And so real quick, because you've already mentioned that you were shooting on beta. So real quick, what was the camera package? Is that something that you put together? Did Michael Griffith is his name? Michael and you, when you were there, was that your camera package? How does that work as far as what you're bringing, along with maybe a small lighting kit?
I hired them.
Not even lighting. I don't think there was lighting involved, because one of the agreements that Ted made with this big production company, it was not more than just an agreement. It was like the only way it was going to happen is if we were totally unobtrusive and really respectful of any kind of boundaries of where you're standing and where your cable is. And so that Michael's camera crew with Dennis Towns doing sound was all very svelte and, minimum of equipment and very polite and quiet and not asking somebody to stand at a different place. Like, we never, in documentary filmmaking in general, especially when it's sort of verite, we never, as a thing of etiquette, we never ask people, could you stand over here so I could get a better shot?
Right.
Or my battery just died. Could you say that again? Like, that was off. That was off the table in terms of this kind of filmmaking that Ted's a proponent of, which is, being extremely unobtrusive and extremely respectful. As a freelance cinematographer, I work with lots of producers who are the opposite of that. They're just constantly telling people what to do and what to say, and it just gives me the creeps. It's like, so my take is that Subway camera package was very minimal, and any kind of extra equipment was probably not really happening. And
then a couple of lights for the interviews that you did separately.
Yes, but one more thing I'd like to say is that the following year, after Homicide was broadcast, I secured some access to the Oval Office when President Clinton was still president in 2000. And Richard was the lead cinematographer on that show. It's called The Press Secretary. And the interesting thing about that was that I won a prize to use the first HD equipment ever to make a television program.
Yeah, Sony Cine Alta.
And so Richard, had to face using gear that was not his own as we went into this historical documentary situation where we had the first access to the Oval Office for a documentary crew since the Kennedy administration. And Richard does some amazing work. It's my favorite 20 minutes I've ever produced, where we were in the Oval Office, Richard and Dennis Towns and myself. And I remember looking down at the presidential seal and on the rug beneath my feet and feeling like I was levitating, right?
Right.
Because there I was.
Right.
That was it for me. I had reached the pinnacle. But there was Richard with this heavy camera, dealing right up close and personal with President Clinton, with the Indian Prime Minister, et cetera, all the cabinet. It was an amazing moment. And Dennis did a fabulous job with audio, too. And I want to say that if it hadn't been for Richard and Dennis and their expertise and their experience, we wouldn't have made out of that what we did.
And that I could not find that. I tried to watch that last night and I could not find that anywhere. But also mentioned that was a springboard for eventually the TV series West Wing. Is that true?
No, that's not true. West Wing.
That's not true. Okay, well, let's dispel that myth.
Well, what's interesting is West Wing had been on. I think they were in season 4, and I happened to be directing a Levinson Fontana drama in New York when there was an episode of The West Wing that came out that was based on the press secretary, and it was called Access, and it was the same story structure. They used Will Lyman, my narrator. They had a producer in the tease who was myself coming to talk to the press secretary. I mean, it was a making of the press secretary, except it was in reverse. They took a documentary and they made a drama out of it. And I remember
interesting.
It won an Emmy for best actress in a leading role. That episode did, but it's kind of amazing to see how these things kind of come full circle. Where I took advantage of a Homicide episode to turn it into a documentary, and then West Wing took my documentary and turned it into. It was quite something, and I'll make sure you get a chance to see it.
I just had one random question. The voiceover, Will Lyman, I'd love that guy to narrate my life. He's so good at that documentary. Who is Will Lyman?
So I'm going to continue to brag. So in 1981, I was making a Nova called The Cobalt Blues, and it was about strategic minerals in South Africa and how the U.S. needed to make some ethical trade-offs for defense purposes. And I was looking for a narrator, and my editor at the time, Bill Anderson, said, well, I've got this friend. He's starting to develop his career as a voice actor, and maybe so I hired Will Lyman, and Will narrated that show. And as we were in post-production, cutting in the narration, the executive producer of a wonderful historic series called Vietnam: A Television History, walked by, and he heard Will Lyman being cut into the Cobalt Blues. And he said to me, "Who's that?" And I said, "Well, it's Will Lyman." And then Will Lyman got hired, and that was his first real gig after my Nova, which was to narrate this amazing Vietnam: A Television History series that won all kinds of awards and is historic. And so that's Will's story. And now, of course, he's been at Frontline ever since then, which is maybe 30 years. And they have an exclusive with him now. But I was able to convince David Fanning, who was the executive producer of Frontline at the time, to let me use Will. And so Will narrates this film, and Will also narrated The Press Secretary.
Iconic voice for sure now. And you talked a little bit about this earlier about, Homicide at the time being groundbreaking, and it caught your attention because of its handheld style and the jump cuts. When you go into a project like this where you're documenting somebody else's art or somebody else's style, do you try to incorporate some of that into the way you shoot, into the way you edit it, or not? Or is your documentary style more to be invisible, as a platform for that? Or does it sort of work really well together because the show was shot with the handheld Verite, which is also a documentary?
It's a good question. Ted may have more to say about this, but in the case of Homicide, conceptually, the technique of cinematography for Homicide was already imitating documentary camera work. So there's nothing that, like, normally if it was a very, a dolly Steadicam kind of thing, and we were doing a documentary, then our documentary camera work would stand out. It would be a contrast. But in this case, there was no point in trying to make our style any different because they're stealing our style as documentarians from the beginning. And if anything, we're just shooting without even worrying about any kind of like camera movement or bumps or anything, because that's all legal inside the episode. So it was very little contrast. When I look at the film now, Ted's documentary, it's almost like seamless between the show's cinematography and the documentary. It's just like it's kind of like the same kind of wavy, slowly moving thing, with the exception of like circular dolly track shots or whatever. So I think in this case it was just like very easy to decide to blend in because they're already shooting documentary imitative style camera work.
Well, I think it's Fred Allen, the comedian, who said that imitation is the sincerest form of television. and so what we try to do is steal as much as we can, right, Richard? But the great thing about Richard is that you put Richard, as a director, you put Richard in a situation and you know he's going to make the most of it. So, for example, with Jay Rabinowitz, the editor in the cutting room at Chelsea Piers, there's Richard filming Tom Fontana looking at a cut of the episode, or Yoshimura looking at a cut of the episode and getting all the close-ups you need. And of course, one thing that makes a great situation for a documentary is when your characters are distracted. They're not thinking about you being there or the camera recording what they're doing. They're just so focused that they are allowing you to capture what they're doing. And so Richard took total advantage of that. Tom Fontana will tell you when he's taking notes that he can only look at something once for the first time. And so you can be sure that if we were disturbing Tom during a screening, that he would have let us know, and probably he would have asked us to leave, or at least to back off, and so would have Yash. So it's because of Richard's skill, his sensitivity to reading the situation, that we get in those shots that we do, or that he does, because he knows he can feel the vibe, he can read the room and make the most of it.
And there's some really nice, like layering. I'm going to say obviously double, but sometimes triple exposures in some of those scenes where Yash or Tom are watching the edit. And then there's, instead of like cutting back and forth to the editing screens, you're using what they're seeing in layers over them. And you also did that, I believe, in the writing process and the editing process, where Yash is working, and then you see the script, the actual script pages and the words double and triple exposure over them. Is that something that, I mean, obviously some of it you have to be looking at the footage and thinking about it afterward, but is that a style that you've used before, or did that sort of make sense for the show? It just was really effective. So I just was curious how you come to that.
Well, that's Dick Bartlett, the editor, at work for sure. But, he has to have the visual assets to make that work. And so I'm always thinking about how I should avoid being satisfied. I'm always looking for more and more and more connection to make it more authentic. And so, making sure I have the script and that it's in the machine so that Dick can use it as a visual asset. Making sure that, for example, the party at the bar in Fells Point, where everyone's sitting around and watching the show that night on Friday night, I wanted to be there for that. And then, it was a late night. So how do I make sure that I'm with Yoshimura at 10 a.m. when he goes to the office on Saturday morning to punch in for the ratings? I mean, that's a really important moment, because it's not just, well, the show is broadcast and that's it. But no, let's get back to the commercial aspect of it. Let's remember what 2020 and Nash Bridges are doing, and then figure out that Yash is willing to get up early the next morning after his successful broadcast and go and punch the numbers and find out that, they topped Nash Bridges. But wait a minute, we find out when the real numbers come in that they didn't, right? So it's a matter of twists and turns, and I try to visualize it from the point of view of the audience. And whatever the audience think is about to happen, I want to give them something else. So they're expecting, if this is a Valentine to Homicide, that the episode broadcast is the end. But no, the next morning we find out, well, maybe they won. And then we find out, no, actually they lost.
Right.
They came in third. So what does that mean? Was it a successful episode or not? And then you find out they won a Peabody Award. I think Homicide won 3 of those, which is the most decorated drama ever from that particular award. And so it sort of bounces back and forth between what people expect and ultimately lands in a good place. But there are plenty of difficult passages along the way. And I always forget, no matter how many times I do this, how difficult it's going to be to accomplish this well. And it's a good thing I do, I guess, because I'd never do it again if I didn't forget that. But it's almost directly proportional. However difficult it's going to be is how stressed I get about it. And then I forget it, and the amnesia leads me to do something else.
Richard, I had a question for you. Ted just mentioned a little bit earlier that you're the master of the art of invisibility. What is the trick to this? How can you, especially these cameras were huge. How do you sort of disappear into the background and prioritize shots and not disturb these situations going on?
I suppose there's different theories about that, and different cinematographers and documentary directors might have a different strategy. For me, I've always had a huge commitment toward trust. And trust means that if I'm filming somebody, rich, poor, in stress, whatever the situation is, off camera even, or before starting to roll something important, is to make sure that they understand I'm a human being with a camera. I'll introduce myself. I will never film somebody, without talking to them first. And having them sort of say, I'm a person, my name's Richard or whatever. And then, as in all documentary filmmaking, we usually have a very short time to build a rapport. We don't have days and weeks of getting to know somebody and eating dinner with them. So in minutes or hours, we have to get somebody to be themselves and to stop thinking about the camera and the microphone. And over time, I've been doing this 40 some years. Over time, you develop the ability, we as documentary people develop the ability to read the room and figure out what people's nervousness is about and disable it quickly. And sometimes it's just little conversations. Do you have a dog? I have a dog. What kind of dog is yours? And then just sometimes it's only that. Sometimes it's some kind of sucking up to and having some trust built on the fact that I'm so glad to be here. This is such a privilege. And Ted is really good at that too. When you are given access, like this documentary, to this production, it's an unprecedented type of access. And Ted, is extremely cognizant of that the whole time. And so very polite, very careful, very respectful of the privilege of being there. Because if the privilege doesn't happen, then it's like, get the hell out of here. I mean, Susan, you even said that sometimes a news crew will come to a production that you're working on a movie of. And, from your point of view, it's like, get these guys out of here.
Right.
These guys are just...
Get out of my way.
They're in your face.
Yeah. They're blocking the doorway. Yeah. They're blocking the doorway, or they're...
No, I don't have a battery charge for you. Get away from me.
And so in this case, Ted and the crew for this documentary, just incredibly respectful and careful. But with every documentary, my answer is it starts with a human contact and a trust. And then, as soon as possible, turn the camera on and start rolling. But don't just come into somebody's hospital room or somebody's kitchen or somebody's classroom and say, okay, we're filming. I need you to stand over there. I need a shot of the kids over here. You can't do that and get good footage. You can do it, but you end up getting horrible footage. And that's what, news teams often end up with, is very kind of staticky stuff. But if you want to get in somebody's head, they have to sort of not forget about you, but they have to know that they can trust you. The idea of being a fly on the wall is an incorrect goal. It's even Frederick Wiseman and the Maisels and people said this is a terrible expression. It's not the goal of documentary, is to be a fly on the wall, to be invisible, because that is like a security camera, which doesn't always have the right place and doesn't have the ability to ask somebody if they can come around or just move around somebody. And so it's deeper than that. It's something about trust and something about relationship.
And there's one other point I'd like to make about that. I completely agree with Richard, as usual, but I would also like to say that because of reality television, what's happened is...
Was that an editorial comment, Richard? Go ahead.
What's happened is, and I think Barry Levinson first discussed this with me, and I agree with him as well. People now have invented for themselves an on-screen persona because they're used to posting TikTok or YouTube, or they've been in a documentary or something like that. And so you have to take that into account when you're interviewing someone now, because you want to burn that off,
Right.
and get to a more natural place.
Interesting.
But I think what Barry said to me first was, when he used to watch Groucho Marx on You Bet Your Life on television in the 50s, there was always a charming piece where Groucho would interview these people on television. And it was such an amazing experience for them to be on television that they were disarmed and they were themselves. They were distracted and they didn't present in a certain way that they had imagined for themselves. But now, I don't know if Richard agrees, almost everyone you talk to not only wants to present in a certain way, but they want to talk to you about where they want the camera to be and how they want the lighting to be and what about the location and all of the kind of decisions that we make and bring to the shoot, they've already thought about. And how do you get past that, Richard?
Well, first of all, a blanket criticism is that the reality television genre is a bastardization of documentary filmmaking, and it's caused great angst for me because it's so inauthentic. Reality shows are cast, their people are being paid lots of money, and then producers are taking these people aside and saying, your brother said that he thinks you're a little fat. And then we go, they go to some person and say, your girlfriend thinks that you're a little bit overweight. And then they create these tears and this embarrassment and sexual arousal and anger and all these human emotions. All 20 emotions are like scripted. And in documentary filmmaking, the kind that I grew up with and respect, this is like a no-no. You film what's there. You rely on chance and serendipity. You plan for things, but you don't tell somebody to be embarrassed. You don't manipulate them to be angry. You just try to be there when things happen. And so now, but Ted's right. Like 40 years ago, if we documentary people come to town and start asking the mayor and people on the street, to talk and be themselves, it was very easy for them to feel comfortable because they weren't thinking about how they're going to look on TV. And now if you go to the same shoot, the same idea, they stand in certain places and they say things that they've heard people say in reality shows, and they try to imitate this kind of like...
Let me just say...
The persona.
I have had the occasion to be a one-man band as a filmmaker in Africa many times in the last 10 or 15 years, working for different charities and other productions. And once I was in Tanzania, and I was all by myself, and I was with the Maasai women who were staying apart from the men, of course. And I went up there with my rig, and as soon as I got ready to shoot, they all pulled a smartphone out of their shirt and started filming me as I was filming them. And I just realized that's just how it is now. Everyone's a director, everyone is a producer, everyone is a content creator, and you just have to figure out how to swim in that stream.
It's a new thing that you have to disarm. Like we talked about disarming nervousness or whatever. It's also a new thing to get people to not do artificial things. Like my classic example, and it's happened 100 times, you come to somebody's house, you're just there for the morning, you want to do some B-roll of this family that's being featured in this documentary, and you want to just sort of get some footage of them as a family on a Saturday. And you arrive with the camera and the crew, and you say hi, and you have this rapport, and then, the person... It's common for the person to say, like, we fixed up the house and we bought a jigsaw puzzle and we thought we'd go to the museum, and like the kids in the background are like, we never go to the museum.
So
it's all because this woman we're visiting thinks they wanted B-roll of the family. So she's engineered a whole day of B-roll choices.
Wow.
And it makes me sick.
Are they dressed in their Sunday best as well?
Yeah, they fixed up the house. And no, we want you to authentically, and it's really, it just reverses the idea of like being somewhere with real people doing real things. It's just hard.
Interesting. I'm thinking about, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, the sort of philosophy that you bring to your work, but and I'm probably answering my own question, but do you think that, you saw the show and you're really impressed with the show, but this is like a what if. It comes through very strongly that you were really intrigued by the show and that you liked the show, and that because when I watched the documentary, I feel like it speaks to how I felt working on it and how proud we were of working on it and how frustrated we were that there were these pressures because we weren't getting enough ratings. And by God, how could we be losing to Nash Bridges? I mean, and I think that emotion, even though you're presenting it sort of on a plate, here's what happened on this day, here's what happened on this day, here's what happened on this day. I think the viewer comes through with that emotion and that same kind of frustration of here's this amazing, groundbreaking piece of art that is not getting its due. And do you think that had a lot to do with your own feeling for the show? Or am I just painting all that into it?
No, I believe it's a magical process, but somehow if you mean it, the meaning comes shining through. And if you don't mean it, that's the converse is also true. But I felt a certain way about Homicide by watching it for years and by watching also what else Tom and Barry had done. And so I am saluting their work for sure. And one thing about documentary that I've learned is that it becomes more valuable over time. So you make a documentary, it has a splash, and that's a wonderful thing. And then 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years later, someone won a Nobel Prize and someone, won an Olympic gold medal and someone did something else amazing. Or now we have the president we have, and you can compare him to Bill Clinton in the Oval Office. So the documenting a particular event at a particular place and time has ultimate value. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing it for money or you're doing it for other wrong reasons, the meaning is not going to come shining through, and nor is the sentiment. But if you're doing it for the right reasons, and I can't divine why this is true, it somehow always works out.
And it really comes through too that obviously that Tom and Barry cared, and Yash, that dedication and heartfelt love for the project that they had. So, once again, I keep talking about layers, but these layers of the caring of how the show was made and why the show was made and what they wanted to sort of communicate with the show really comes through. And, this should be on, hello, Peacock, I'm talking to you again. Your documentary should be on Peacock for all the people and the millions of people that missed it initially, that have no idea at all about it. Like you said, The Wire is the one that everybody remembers. So that people can look at the show, look at the documentary and see what the history of it coming to fore and how we managed to survive for 7 years and how well respected it was for people that have no clue. So Peacock, get this documentary on Peacock so people can watch the show and watch the background of it as well.
But don't you agree, Susan and Chris and Richard, that every show has its own tribe? So you won't find people who work on Homicide and who then work on Nash Bridges, right? Or who work on Homicide and then work on some other network drama. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of migration between the Dick Wolf shows and the Levinson Fontana shows because they're in New York or whatever. But most of the time, the people working on the show are part of a unit, and they have a similar worldview and a sympathy toward each other that makes the show what it is. So you're someone like me going into that moment, and you're realizing, this is my tribe, too. I'm a part of this tribe. Maybe I'm a distant relation, but this is part of the circle that I either want to be in or feel myself in already. And they can recognize that. So it's a very serendipitous and enlightening moment when you get to sit with someone like Tom Fontana in the room, and say, Tom, this is what I want to do. This is my vision for the documentary. And as Tom says in the documentary, when someone has a passion to do something, the best thing to do is to get out of their way. He's completely right about that.
And also completely unique for a producer in that, right? So you became part of the tribe, and you directed some episodes of Oz or The Wire. Tell us a little bit about what you continued to do with them.
Well, I directed one episode of Oz, the penultimate episode, and I directed two other Levinson Fontana dramas. One was called The Jury. That was on Fox, and one was called, it was on the CW. It was called, forgive me.
Not the Bedford Diaries, was it?
Yes, Bedford Diaries, correct. So I directed an episode of that, and that happened to be the last episode of Bedford Diaries because it was canceled when we were in production. But they were two really wonderful series that made it. And it's also important to realize that, Homicide did something extremely difficult, which was to last for 7 years. I mean, most series don't, and it did. And so while we might lament that there were 130-something episodes that were produced and not 200, that's an astounding achievement for a creative, groundbreaking series like that to make it as far as it did without pandering and without dumbing itself down. So I feel, I hope that the documentary can get picked up along the way by Peacock or anyone else, but I'm sure it will be. And I know it's been taught in many film schools, and I teach it myself. I use the script and the call sheet and the dailies together with the documentary. And by the time students have spent 5 or 6 or 10 hours following those things, they really get it. The only thing that's done differently right now is, because of cell phones and digital devices, there's that aspect to the production that wasn't available when we were shooting in the 90s. But also, we didn't have the issue of cameras on set so that executives could follow the production day and see whether you were making the day or not. That's a big problem, I think, right now, is that, you have people all over the world who can tap into your shooting and to your production day, and they can make decisions about your script or about your production that can affect you dramatically, as it were. So, there are going to be a lot more layers like this that are going to vex producers going forward. And will there be documentaries like mine going forward? I don't know. I think that there's a lot at stake, and for people in the business who want to maintain editorial control, which Levinson Fontana didn't, by the way, over mine, it's a problem. Let me also say that we had a really marvelous screening at the Senator Theater in Baltimore of the documentary in advance of the last season of Homicide, what turned out to be the last season of Homicide. And that was a really special moment for everyone to come together and celebrate the series. And I'll remember that fondly forever.
Wow. So wait, I need to jump back. So are you, this is because I've been out of the business for 30 years. So are you saying that there are, in effect, surveillance cameras on sets now so the producers can watch what's happening, as opposed to, I think at some times when we were on the squad room sets, somebody said that that Finnerty sometimes was able to listen through it through the open mic. I'm not sure how they set that up, but are you saying that they're actually watching what's happening on their productions?
Yes. Yes,
they have the video assist feed.
What's it called?
Well, they have the video assist feed. They have access to things that are already being shot, and they can hear conversations in front of Video Village or whatever.
Oh, but they can do it from far away.
Well, so with Homicide,
just on the set.
With Homicide, which was shot on film, the film would get shipped, and it would take a day to process, and it would take another day for somebody to get it onto tape, and then for the producers to look at the tape. So that would be a couple, 3 days after the particular performance or scene. And that would be too late to do anything about it, because a lot of times the guest star or that particular actor wouldn't be available for the next day, and you would have moved on from that particular set anyway. So you couldn't go back and do a pickup. But now
we did have video assist though. We did have video assist.
Well, sure, video assist on location.
Right. There's nobody's taping.
So in Video Village, you could you could look in Video Village and see if you needed to do more takes or if you were going to move on. But now, if you're sitting in Australia and you have some money in a particular production and you want to be looking, at what's happening in real time, does the director need to take that one more time or not?
Wow.
Maybe the director wants to move on. Maybe the producer doesn't, vice versa. Time is money. I mean, it's the whole Jim Finnerty tapping on his watch idea, right?
Right. Have a conscience.
Yeah, and you managed to catch the time is money.
Time is money. And he says, that was great. You caught that in the, time is money, pal.
Time is money, pal. Time is money.
Who was he directing that at? I couldn't see who he was talking to when he said that.
Probably the ADs. Yeah.
The ADs. Well, the ADs knew that. I sort of assumed it was at the director, but I don't remember if he was in the shot or not.
I love Finnerty. I just think he's such a wonderful character in this movie. You're not going to get your 300 extras for 8 days, right?
Right. So that's interesting, because that was a particularly interesting piece to catch in the production office with Finnerty. What were some of the things that stick out for you where you knew you were in the right place at the right time, had captured something that was pretty, well, obviously the whole thing was special, but you know what I mean? Any things that stick out to you like that, like the conversation, the very frank conversation with Jim Finnerty and Jim Yashimura in the production office? What kind of things stuck out for you?
That one did. The tone meeting where the assistant director and the director and the writer were talking about their visions for what was possible and what they wanted. But I also knew if they went off to scout a location and sent me off on a wild goose chase to another location because they didn't want me to go along, that I was in the right place, because I respected their vision. I wanted them to have some time away from me, and it turned out that they were rehearsing without letting me know, where the director and Vincent and some other people were running lines and not letting me know. And that's fine. You just have to realize that you're not always going to be in the right place at the right time. But I feel that in the moment, you don't really know if you're getting it. You have a good sense that you are. And for example, when Vincent is doing his interview and he says, "It's always good when you get the writer. It's always good when you get the writer." Then that's a moment, right? And there are 10 of those that happen along the way. But then you go back and you look at the dailies and you say, yeah, there's some great stuff in here. I didn't know what Gary Fleeter was saying to Yashimura or what Alex Zakshevsky was saying to Yashimura after midnight on the set. So it took me, the next day to realize what we had there. But even then, it's not until you put everything into context in the documentary that you realize what you have.
Right, because that point was after the tension building, right? The tension building on the set, and then that little, listening in, eavesdropping.
One other thing I'd like to say.
No, go.
Forgive me for talking over you, Susan, but I always felt that the girlfriend of John Lang, there was a mistake made with her costuming, because at the end of this show, she's dressed in this sort of dark running suit, and I really didn't get the idea until watching the episode a couple of more times that was her running through all of the EMT vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
I felt that if they had put her in a brighter color, that would have made more of
interesting.
An impact. So that whole story about looking for her and ball drop and all that stuff, I think I felt like that was written for the Homicide audience and also for some comic relief. But there were some bigger fish to fry on that production, and I thought that there were a couple of different things in the B and the C stories that could have been developed. I will say, though, that I think Bruce McVitie did a fabulous job as Bedrin. What a wonderful acting job that was by Bruce. Casting, too, was really super special. And again, I go back to thinking about Vincent, and what if Vincent hadn't been available? This was 2 or 3 days right before the first day of shooting. Who would have done it? And what would that have meant had it not been Vincent? That's how close they came to the edge of not really having anything special. Unless it would have been somebody else who would have done a more amazing job. Who can know?
Yeah. It's also hard when you're watching the documentary to understand how he managed to, within 2 or 3 days, get that script in his head and be able to give that kind of performance. And I love the interview you did with him where he says, on the one hand, boy, it really would have been nice to have 2 or 3 days worth of rehearsal. And then he said, on the other hand, the way that they shoot, the way we were shooting, how fast we were shooting, it gave a kind of energy and visceral, closeness to the script, I guess, for him, that he thought it also worked. But it is kind of amazing watching that timeline, which the timeline is so good through the documentary of how everything came together, that he had almost no time to absorb that script and then give that kind of performance. And it is the kind of thing where you say to yourself, yeah, what would that episode have been like in somebody else's hands, either with his part or even with a different director? How would it have been? Well, it's like Andre said about the directors. Well, they're a guest in our house for 7 days. There's this whole sort of double-edged sword, which we always had talking about the directors. Was like, yeah, they come in and think they're going to put their stamp on it, and they got to jump into the river and go with the flow, or they're going to get run over. And I think there was some good recognition of the tension between Gary wanting to try to impart something of his own experience and his own artistic vision on it, and him realizing he's just going to get run over, by the steamroller. And there was really you mentioned the tone meeting. It was really interesting to me because being on the set and being a camera assistant on the set, I don't see pre-production. I don't see the writing stuff. I don't see any of that. So a lot of these things were really eye-opening to me. And I loved how you also delineated, at some point in the tone meeting, Yashimura is like, oh God, like there goes my script, right? They're making decisions that were not what was in my head. And then it comes full circle when you're back in the editing room with Jay Rabinowitz, by the way, who looks like a 12-year-old in the documentary. I just met him for the first time at the reunion in December. I was like, oh my God, he looks like he's 10. It was so cute. But when Gary says something like, hey, Yash, I'm going to leave you my phone number. And Yash says, Gary, you're dead to me, which was one of the lines in the film. But also, Yashimura's like, get out of here. And then the voiceover says Yashimura then regains control of his script at that point. Yeah. So that stuff is so really incisive, insightful and interesting, even for me, who worked on the show and read the script and knew all the players. So yeah, really, really comprehensively well-told story.
Yeah.
Really,
I'm intrigued to see the Fleeter cut at some point, just out of interest academically, just to see how it differed in post. But yeah,
yeah, because Yash said we got to get rid of that arty, too much arty ending. It needs to be more frenetic. It needs to be So, yeah.
When Andre Braugher says that line, he has a funny smirk on his face. He says, "We think of them as invited guests
for
7 days
in our house for all 7 days."
Well,
sorry. So
when he looks like the cat that ate the canary is what he looks like.
When Susan and I knew Andre for years through the production and some other things, and so we could read his face, and what he's really not saying explicitly is that, and he's not talking about Gary Fleeter, but he's talking in general that some of the directors they had on Homicide were jackasses and difficult people who tried to put some arty spin on what was already a machine running. And Andre's like look in his face. It's
smile.
Like, I'm not going to say anything more.
Right. He's got like the Joker smile, right? Like,
he is a brilliant man.
Terrific.
I loved Andre. I felt so sad when I learned that he died.
Horrible. What a shock.
What a shock.
So younger than me.
I wanted to say something. I'm not sure I can articulate this, but
go ahead.
One thing, as a Baltimore cinematographer who'd worked on all these different things, one of the brilliant things behind Homicide is David Simon's insistence on authenticity in the plot and in the writing of all the episodes. This is true of The Wire too, that having somebody in the background who's a brilliant writer, David Simon, who's not really featured that much in this documentary, but what all of us, even on the camera crew, there was this like real respect for Simon's vision that's behind it all. You may or may not like him. He may be difficult to talk to off the cuff, but the guy is a genius at taking real life and putting it into a fictional scripted format where the goal of the scripted format is to be authentic. So if we had done this documentary, Ted, on an episode of Nash Bridges or even The Sopranos or something, where writers are inventing shit off the, out of their heads, and then they're presenting them into this script, it doesn't come from the Baltimore Sun murder writer who knows the streets and the language and the ilk of this story, so much so that the documentary of this fictional piece that's documentary imitative, it kind of like, it's a thread that goes through both of the formats, the documentary and the show itself, is what is the real king here? The king is truth. The king is realism. And so if something is said that's unrealistic or a camera does something unrealistic, it's edited out. It's put to the side. And I don't think a lot of shows are like that. I think most writers and producers of shows, yes, they want it to look real sometimes, but there's something about the Simon content that is a little bit stronger than the average, written material that's trying to look real.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't really explain it.
Yeah.
Well, it's based on a true story. There's one other Marquez quote that I researched before this, which was that he called journalism the best job in the world, quote unquote, and a biological necessity of humanity, quote unquote. And I think that that's absolutely right. And because David was a journalist first, that infused everything he did from that point on. And I remember when we were in the Homicide offices, he was just then starting to talk about and negotiate with people about The Corner before The Wire. So he had already, I wouldn't say moved on from Homicide, but he was already thinking about his next move. And I want to say that this episode was one of the first ones where he was the producer on set by himself in this particular season, because I think on the previous season, he hadn't done that yet. So he was just making his bones, as it were, as a filmmaker at that time too.
Yeah, he wasn't on the staff writer until what, Chris? Like
season 4, I think it was.
Season 4, maybe?
4, yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, and I think the other thing that's super special about this show, and I worked on, other big features and other, network television shows when I lived in LA, was that anything else I worked on, I would say, the writer comes on the set, the director kicks him off. This didn't happen. This show, the writers and the producer and Tom Fontana, who was such a mentor bringing people up from the writer's office, bringing up assistants, bringing up Joy Lusko and people that were working assistants in the writer's office. So that the respect off the set and on the set for the writers. Now, we may see the writers come on the set and go, oh God, like it's going to slow things down. But the production had ultimate respect for the writers, and they were always part of what we were doing and how it was going, and if it was staying true to the tone and what they wanted the episode to be about. So that was really special. And what a thing and I've mentioned this in other episodes, but what a production crew and producers for David Simon to have been hooked into, where the writer was king, basically, because Tom Fontana was such an amazing writer-producer and had ultimate respect for that. And that idea of like stepping back. If somebody has a passion for their work, don't get in their way. And I would say that that's unique for television, for sure.
One thing I was going to ask you about the show, Teddy, was obviously you were a fan of the show before doing the documentary. So what was it like for you being on the set and watching it all happen?
Well, I was very stressed, I must admit, when I was in Baltimore, because I was shooting and one thing I like to do is have a contemplative experience when I'm not working on that particular day. So oftentimes I'll just get in my rent-a-car and drive around the city, which I remember doing that a lot on that particular show, going to all different parts of the city. And, that came through when Richard was shooting that scene that opens the documentary with David Simon behind the wheel.
Yes.
I mean, that's a great scene. Richard has a great story about that. That's just a perfect opportunity for me to say, Chris, that I was thinking about everything else other than what we were shooting that day as we're riding around the city, and I'm thinking to myself, how is this going to work? Why did I do this? Please, someone talk me out of doing this. And then there's Richard rolling, and Richard can tell you this great story about David Simon as we're going through East Baltimore, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah, well, East and West maybe, but it was just a thing. It was so easy for him to do because I guess, Ted, you had asked him, let's just talk to you and reflect on Baltimore and the streets and anything you want to say. You were very open with him, which was great. And he drove around, and the things you see in the documentary are very authentic, off-the-cuff things that he's talking about. But the thing that became an outtake for reasons of, what do you call it? Profanity on network television at that time, documentary or fiction, was not allowed in the way that David Simon normally talks. But while he's driving around, he started by talking about the homicide detectives in real life and how he spent many, many hours and years, writing with them, riding with them and writing about them. And he I forget how it started, but he had some kind of conversation. It's been many years, but he's like, when these detectives talk to each other, they have kind of their own language. And it took me a while to figure this out, but like they use the word fuck in 6 or 7 different ways having to do with the inflection. And then he imitated conversation. He's like, just still driving, but he's like, one detective will sit in the front in the middle of the night and they're out looking for some person or something. One guy will say, oh, fuck. And then the other one will say, fuck? And I says, fuck. And these things are reflecting around them. It's like there's another call on the radio that they have to go to, and one says to the other, oh, fuck. And the other one says, fuck, fuck, and they have this conversation just with the word fuck that goes on for a whole page of dialogue, and they know what each other's saying. That they're meaning this other thing. And David, he had probably thought of it before and talked about it before, but he's just like, had this conversation, and I'm thinking, as I'm shooting this, I'm just thinking, God, I wish this could be in the documentary, because it was really funny. And he wasn't laughing. He wasn't trying to be funny. He was actually trying to teach us what these different, fuck words mean. And
But again,
no longer an outtake, right?
No, it wouldn't be maybe now. I don't know. Network TV it still would be, but
yeah.
But again, you put someone like David Simon in a situation where he's going to be distracted, right? So he's driving and he's surveying the landscape and seeing cop cars and other things that are happening. So, but he's continuing to talk to us, right? So that's why you get the ring of truth, because he's busy and his mind is split between the conversation he's having with you and what else he has to be doing. And that's a setup that is a recipe for success.
Mm-hmm. And that scene, you know, the whole language of fuck. There's a brilliant scene in The Wire where they do that. I don't know if you guys remember that scene. I think they're in a room trying to work out the angle of a bullet or something, and there's a whole scene that plays in.
Yes, I think that was. I'm sure that's related. That David Simon says, "Well, now I can finally put this into a script."
Yeah, that wouldn't have happened on Homicide. It'd be allowed one, mate. Well, it wouldn't be allowed an F word, but because there's a whole conversation that's quite funny in the documentary about some line about he can't take a dump and something else. He could take one or the other or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, the NBC censors, right? We can only say crap twice, and we can. I'd like to keep the dump in there, and then switch this word for bastards. And yeah, that was pretty. I was surprised they let bastards go through on network television that long ago. So funny. It's just to keep the cat decided he wants to meow, so that's why he's in my lap now. I fed him and he decided he wanted to meow anyway.
Before I forget, I wanted to say something like the context of this is that I used to teach at Johns Hopkins for 10 years on and off in the 1980s, early 90s. And they'd let me teach anything I wanted, and I would teach about Japanese film, German film. And one time I suggested a course called Films Within Films. And I just picked 13 films, and once a week would show them. Students would write about them, we'd talk about them. And they were like Fellini's 8.5 or Truffaut's
Night and Day. Day for Night.
Day for Night, and some documentaries about the making of movies. And so I just made this whole course about this. And I did it for fun. I just thought it'd be cool. What I realized later is that it was an incredible way to teach filmmaking. Because even if things were wrong, if a light would never be on a stand like that, you could actually talk about that. And so because I was in the filmmaking industry and teaching, I could also say, this is what's real in this shoot, and this is what's not, and this is where they cheated. But there were lots of things that were very real. And the students were like, this is the best way to learn filmmaking instead of a boring textbook or whatever, because these glimpses behind the scenes, if you put them all together, they start to have a global meaning about the zen of filmmaking in general. And then years later, I would work with Ted on this documentary, and I was thinking, I'm so sorry I'm not teaching that course again, because Ted's Anatomy of a Homicide documentary is probably one of the best tools for any film student to just look at, because it is a cross-sectional study of what a wardrobe person is and what craft services are and what a writer does and what an editor does. And it's done in this authentic kind of fashion for obvious reasons. And the episode's in the middle of it. So like, I think at the time it was revolutionary. Ted pulled off this major stunt between network and PBS, which was not easy. And then secondly, looking at it back today, it's like this incredible teaching tool for how any episode of any television show operates from start to finish. And yes, there's technological changes and equipment changes and all that stuff, but what's universal about it is that it kind of like goes through the whole production of one episode of a TV show. And I think it's like revelatory. Even when I see it now, I think it's really cool.
So here's a question. So when it was broadcast on PBS, the episode was shown in the middle? Because when I watch it on YouTube, it says the episode is available on the DVD collection.
All,
so when it broadcast, did they show it?
Absolutely, positively. First of all, that's piracy.
I didn't know that.
That's piracy on YouTube. Whoever posted it had no right to do that, and I've asked YouTube to take it down.
The documentary is, but the episode isn't.
The documentary they have no rights to. I own all rights to the documentary. And I can't get YouTube to take it down.
And does PBS have it? Because I couldn't even find it through PBS.
No, they don't have it.
They don't. It's yours. Okay.
It's mine. So
Peacock. This is another reason why Peacock. You need to have it available in partnership with the show.
And let me say that,
write them a letter.
Even as recently as last semester, when I used the script, the call sheet, the documentary, and the dailies to teach this, now I use Richard's book in my classroom as well. So that's the newest layer. So I can have my students read on documentary and understand what it takes to perform all aspects of it. Especially their favorite part happens to be the interview process. So they get to see Richard's work in the documentary, read his book. That's not about the documentary, but is about all of his experiences, and it's really kind of a great fit.
Sounds like a really good class. I hope it's. You should do an online version. It sounds brilliant.
Yeah, next time you have a class, I'll come in and talk about what it used to be like to make films 30 years.
Yeah, right.
Nobody does anymore. Not that way.
So, are there any other memories?
Yeah, any other memories?
Share, like from that experience?
I'm thinking.
So while you're thinking, Richard, you weren't in the underground subway part.
Correct.
Which parts were you?
Before and after the production, there was some planning stuff, and then after
the writer's office, and some
and
of that stuff, and the editing.
Stuff. Yeah,
some of those close-ups in the editing suite were just really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
as they're thinking about what they're doing.
Well, one other thing I remember very well is being in the Homicide production offices and having Anya and Julie and Yash and David Simon and everyone sort of in their own room working on their own episode, and thinking to myself, wow, this is really the dream team here. This is the next generation of great writers who are all in one place at one time, pulling in the same direction. And the scene where Tom gives Yash his notes on the script, and he cuts half a page, and then later on, Yash thinks he got away with it by getting to his office, and Tom walks in and says, the network's going to say, why don't you find the girl? And Yash says, no, not going to happen, not going to happen. That's exactly how it went. People stuck to their guns, and they ultimately got what they want. And that's a great testament to Tom, which is that he knew what was possible and what wasn't possible, and he gave the writers the latitude to take it to the limit. And Barry was the visual genius on the show, who directed the pilot and brought so much of his own craftsmanship and vision to that. So, you put Levinson and Fontana together, and you mix them up with all these incredibly talented writers, and this is what you got.
And actors.
Yeah, and
actors.
Yeah.
And we had Tom and Julie and Jorge on, I think our second episode. And one of the things that Julie and Jorge said, and others have said later, but specifically the writers said that they have not had that kind of experience since then. They've all gone on to do other major things, but the freedom that they had, which you just expressed, the freedom that they had on Homicide, and that they were able to stick to their artistic vision, is something that they did not have not experienced since then, which was like, wow. Which, like you said, is a testament to Tom and Barry's nurturing of the artists, and how he knew how talented they were, and then also mentoring the ones that were coming up. We often ask people, although we probably have answered this just through the whole conversation, is the show is still relevant today. Now people may not remember it, or people may be coming into the first time. It's not very dated. There are some hairstyles that are dated and things like that, but generally the same social issues, racism, sexism, classism, the same tensions in people's lives. So why do you think it has retained? Because it still has its fans. Obviously, it's hardcore fans, but I think it's probably gaining some new fans. Why do you think the show still holds up 30 years later?
Because it has the ring of truth to it. Because it comes from an authentic place. Because It's about the human condition, which will never change. There will always be people who are up and who are down, and there will always be the people who have to live in that place where they're cleaning up a gigantic mess. And it just happens more so. It doesn't change. I mean, people aren't changing. They're just becoming more so. And I think that that's the thing. You have a wonderful stage play from the 19th century that works. You have George Clooney on Broadway doing something from the 50s that works. You have people who are having to face the same issues, problems that they've always had to face. And you know, we'll never arrive at the solution, but we're obligated to try. And I think that that's the subtext for Homicide, which is that everyone is trying in their own way to make things better.
Good point.
I mean, I can only say, and I have a terrific bias toward this, that fiction, when I watch fictional movies, they either have to be incredibly interesting and entertaining and poetic in their fiction, or they need to be very realistic and truthful with universal emotional truths. The middle ground is where I don't think they last as long. Their shelf life doesn't last as long. But when you watch something like Homicide, which again is based on Simon's, vantage point of a cultural thing, and then based on the talent of the people that produced the episode, why 30 years or whatever it's been later would it ring interesting? I think it's a combination of things, with the fact that, like you said, Ted, it's the truthfulness of it that, makes it much more interesting to watch than an episode of Bewitched, which Susan probably loved as a child. But you know what I'm saying? And so things that, like, fantasy is fantasy, reality is reality. When Hollywood, the major ilk of television writers and producers, make stuff, it usually goes out of date fairly quickly if it's not based on these universal truths. The universal truths that are biblical, Shakespearean, Dickensian, like universal truths between people that really are kind of timeless. Those things, I think, tend to, the more you paid attention to reality and realism, the better they're going to last. That's my feeling. I think I might be a minority. I don't know.
Well, no, I think if you look at Sean Baker's work, you look at Anora, you look at Tangerine, you look at the Florida Project, that's in this same fabric of Homicide. I think people are hungry for that.
Especially Florida Project, yeah. They're almost like ethnographic documentaries. They're that good at finding some truth. Yeah.
So let's see if that spawns a new generation of people making that.
Yeah.
Artists making that.
Be nice.
Although I would like to wiggle my nose like Samantha Stevens.
You can do that and
get what I want.
Well, a left field question, which I might aim at Teddy first, because Richard's a local to Baltimore, aren't you, Richard? So Teddy, I mean, you're not a local to Baltimore, are you?
No.
So I always ask people this, and you might not have an answer to this, but did you, when you were obviously staying in Baltimore, and obviously you're busy working and a bit stressed out, hopefully at least got a chance to sample some of the food of Baltimore and enjoy some of the kind of things in Baltimore, or any sort of memories of any meals or anything like that you had whilst in Baltimore, any sort of food recommendations, because Baltimore's obviously very famous for its seafood.
I just remember Dwayne Dell, a sound person who's a friend of Richard's and a colleague, sent me to a place for crab cakes south of the city near the Beltway. Maybe Richard knows the name of it. And it was the best crab cake I ever had.
Was it near the airport?
Yes.
Yes, H&M, what's it called?
That's correct.
Oh, H&M, sure, yeah.
That was worth
Holland's
the trip.
Ferry Road, Hammond's Ferry Road.
Yeah.
They still
that
there.
was worth the trip. And
G&M.
Sorry,
G&M, actually.
Wherever. I mean, I just remember it was 4 mica tables, and it's just sort of a hole in the wall.
Middle-aged waitresses in uniform with hairnets.
And also down the street at Snyder's.
Yeah.
Snyder's and G&M, classics.
And there was a diner in Fells Point that I used to go to every morning. Do you know that diner,
Jimmy's.
Richard?
Jimmy's.
Jimmy's. Is that still there?
Yeah, but it's not open. Yeah,
okay.
Unfortunately.
Okay. So I like that. And then I also like going into these little hole-in-the-wall bars I can't remember the name of them, but there was still a Baltimore Colts bar that I went to in Fells Point. I remember that.
Really?
I'm sure these places aren't even there anymore. It's probably all gentrified, but anyway.
That's good.
I remember Ted, because he had come to Baltimore several times, and we all used to travel around quite a bit, so we knew different cities and their different cultures. And Ted, you often said to me, I love coming to Baltimore because I love the people. They're so down to earth and they're so unpretentious. And he, he at the time was in Boston, and I go to Boston all the time. And I said, I don't really see the difference. People in Boston might be smarter. There's Harvard and shit, but and the traffic's worse.
Easy.
But Ted was like, no, people down here, they're you can talk to them in the street and they don't just like walk away and or you meet them at a party and they don't just give you like a verbal resume of all their academic achievements. People in Baltimore just sort of like are down to earth and talk the way they talk. But I remember that was something that you liked about Baltimore, is that,
Mm-hmm.
Well, sure, because I'm from New Jersey, right? And I always like to say, now I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and I always say that Rhode Island is the New Jersey of New England.
Yeah.
Is that true? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a lot like Baltimore. It's got a little bit of an inferiority complex compared to the cities that are around it, right? But I do love Baltimore. I've always loved going to Pimlico and I love just driving around Baltimore. I loved going to the Senator Theater for our documentary premiere. I like going up to Goucher and seeing people on horseback. I mean, it's just a really wonderful place to be when you have some time to yourself.
Interesting. When I was
there was also a German restaurant. I don't know if it's there anymore.
Eichenkrantz.
Yes.
I don't think it's there.
Long gone?
I don't think it's there anymore either. That was in East Baltimore, Highlandtown.
Exactly
Edge of
right.
Highlandtown.
I remember Hausner's, but that's a long time ago.
Yeah. Eichenkrantz was it? Yeah, very 100% German. Yes.
How about for you, Richard? Obviously, being a local, what are your sort of go-tos in Baltimorean cuisine?
We're all good friends with John Waters. We grew up with him before and during his fame and rise. And he always is this great observer to the humorous aspects about Baltimore culture, about being on a bus and the person next to you is clipping their toenails. Not their fingernails, but their toenail. Like John just has a great eye for the things that are really unpretentious, down to earth about Baltimore that he talks about all the time. But there's
food. It's a food question.
He talks about toenails.
Well, I don't know.
We get that in London, to be honest with you. I've seen that happen on the tube a few times.
Yeah, I actually like diners. Yeah. I like scrambled eggs and bacon, and stuff. So Baltimore's got something around every corner like that. But we also go to fancy restaurants and stuff. It's changed a bit.
Lots of diners.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you said that about people being friendly. When I was working on Return to Lonesome Dove out in the middle of the prairie, literally somewhere, and one of the grips at that point, we're chatting, and I find out he had worked here at Moran Towing, which was the tugboat company that was parked next to our stages, and we'd have to stop when the tugboats went in and out. And he said that Baltimore was his favorite place because the people were so friendly. So yeah, it echoes across the country for people that manage to stop by.
So
sure.
Jodie Foster, at the rise of her fame in her 20s maybe, was in Interview magazine, a big interview with her. And she said, the interviewer said something like, you have an apartment in New York and you have an apartment in LA and you go back and forth. And she says, yeah, I go back and forth depending on the project. And somebody said, what's that like in the two cities? Are they different? And Jodie Foster said, yeah, in New York, they say, fuck you, which means have a nice day. And he says, in LA, people say, have a nice day, and it means fuck you. And I love that. But if you think about New York and LA, and then if because we're here, you think about, well, which one is Baltimore? Which one on that scale? And the truth is, it's kind of like, it's underneath that and it's in the middle, and you're not lying when you say, fuck you, you mean it. And when you say, have a nice day, you mean it. Where in LA and New York, there might be this subtext, right? So I kind of like the authenticity of my hometown, because I've traveled all over the world. And when I come home to Baltimore, it's always a little cultural shock. depending on where you've come from. But there's this kind of like warmth and authenticity. It's the way people are saying stuff that's on their mind. They're not really being that polite or careful.
I love that. So any other thoughts? Do you guys want to mention any projects you're working on now or things you're doing now you want to throw out there?
As a freelance cinematographer, I'm always between projects, and I work on lots of independent documentaries. Been doing one last year that hasn't come out yet on anti-Semitism worldwide, and there's a project I'm going to be working on next month a little bit, an independent documentary about food relief to Palestinians in Israel and stuff. But I also work on like local nonprofit organizations, like charities that need to have films and stuff. And because they're mini documentaries, usually they're authentically, at least in the B-roll and the interview kind of aspects, they're real people doing real things, which I always love. So I'm still working a couple of days a week.
And for students of filmmaking and people that are just interested, his book, Documentary Vision, Notes from Behind the Camera, you can Google that and find it find it online.
During COVID, I decided to take 30 or 40 years of what I've learned about good and bad documentary filmmaking and just like write some essays and collect them together. It's a short book, but it got it off my chest because I've often thought of these things.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
And I have a sequel to a movie I made 40 years ago about the Armenian genocide.
Yes.
That's coming out this year.
Good.
That Richard also worked on. So that was a personal documentary I made in 1988, which was the first time that film about the Armenian genocide had ever been broadcast, broke through the Turkish taboo of American television. And now I have 40 years later, a sequel to that coming out.
And when will that be out, and where can people find it? And do you have a working title or a title?
It's called The Vindicators, and it features all of the non-Armenian academics who took chances to document the Armenian genocide. And so we'll see, I think in 2 weeks' time, when Trump decides whether or not he's going to continue to recognize that atrocity or not, that will be my ultimate epilogue sequence. And so when that comes down, that decision comes down, then we'll make a decision about when to release it.
And that's personal to you because you're of Armenian descent. And the original documentary, you took was it your great aunt or your aunt back to her hometown?
It wasn't a relation of mine,
okay.
but I smuggled a survivor when she was 70 years old back into her village, and so we that's another story for another time.
Yeah.
But thank you for remembering that.
Sure. And there are some pieces online of interviews with you from the 100th anniversary of the genocide, 2015,
right?
1915 to 2015. So people could find those online too. So passion project for you as well.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you both Teddy and Richard. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yes.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Thank you so much. This has really been great. A really incisive inside look and just also for people to think about what documentary filmmaking is all about too.
Mm-hmm. That was Ted and Richard. That was a really, really interesting conversation. Was there anything for you, Susan, that sort of stood out?
Oh, there's tons of stuff that stood out. Personally, the thing that I enjoyed, maybe not the most, but one of the things I really enjoyed was that for me, the documentary and then being able to talk to Teddy and Richard, personally gave me an insight into the pre-production and the post-production, of course, which as a camera assistant and somebody who just stayed on the set, I wasn't one of those people that was trying to write a script and hand it to the writer's office, which some people did and actually got into that and became successful writers.
Oh, good for them. Good for them.
But I learned so much watching the documentary and then interviewing them about what the pre-production process is and what the post-production process was. So, I think I might have mentioned this in the middle of the conversation somewhere, that for anybody in the future that asks me, what's the big deal about Homicide? Watch this documentary, because it is an amazing piece of work. Not just to show how network dramas were produced in the 90s, but how different this one was and what a struggle it was to keep it on the air. And like I think Ted said toward the end, it was a struggle to keep it on the air, but what an amazing thing that we were on for 7 seasons. Now, 2 of those were truncated seasons. Nevertheless, that we were on for 7 seasons, even in the face of the fact that we were losing to, okay, I'll give 2020 their props, right? But we were losing to Nash Bridges. It's just still.
Which was the Don Johnson sort of his succession show after Miami Vice, set in San Francisco, which was a very different kettle of fish cop-wise. I mean, it's a very buddy-buddy kind of cop show that's not at all realistic, and it was a kind of an adventure of the week kind of thing. And that was huge in the 90s.
Huge ratings.
It was,
Yeah, so it was frustrating because we knew how well-written and well-acted this show was. And then to have the pressures from above, to boost the ratings and how to do that. And they changed some of the formula later in the later seasons, maybe mostly in seasons 6 and 7, maybe 7. But anyway, that I just thought it was a great education, even for me, for someone who worked on the show. This documentary was so interesting because so many of those details about way back when the entire idea for the show came together and how it started and how, how the production came together was just really, really interesting. And the origin stories too. I loved both of their origin stories.
Yeah. One interesting question Teddy mentioned, because he's been using the documentary as a resource in a class he teaches, a film school class. And one of the things that kind of came out in pre-production that doesn't come across in the documentary but came across in our chat with Teddy was the fact that apparently the episode may have been written with another kind of actor in mind, an African-American actor who had been approached and apparently turned it down. Teddy doesn't mention the name of the actor. He does mention Samuel L. Jackson, but I don't believe it was Samuel L. Jackson was the actor. I think he just mentioned Samuel L. Jackson because he came to mind. But the question about how that episode could have been so different had John Lang been played by somebody else, and the impact choice of actor makes on a role and a story, because obviously Vincent D'Onofrio is fantastic in that episode. Vincent was nominated for a Primetime Emmy for his guest spot in the episode, and he's fantastic in it. There's nothing, this speculation's not to take anything away from Vincent D'Onofrio. It's more about just how that could have changed the dynamic between his character and Pemberton, especially if the character had been a black actor. It would have sort of added some extra layers to the conversation. But such an interesting question. I didn't even consider the episode had been written with somebody in particular in mind, because when you watch the documentary, one of the things they're struggling with is actually to fill that role, because they talk about how a lot of actors, for some reason, turned it down. They didn't feel it was a particularly, can't remember the way it was worded in the documentary now, but a few actors sort of just weren't that particularly interested in being on the show for whatever reason, which shocks me considering it was Homicide. But there we go. Maybe they thought of the logistics of being stuck between a train on a platform for a few days solid probably didn't appeal to them.
Yeah, and I do want to give a shout out. Jim Yashimura also was nominated for an Emmy for that episode, which makes it even more interesting to watch this process, the process Jim went through to write it, and how many hands it goes through. Pre-production, during production, and then obviously because the director's sort of more in charge during production, and then in post-production he gets it back and gets to be the chief voice in the edit. So it's just interesting that Vince and also Jim were both nominated for Emmys for that.
It was quite interesting also watching Tom's interaction with Jim during the kind of the writing process, and I think he challenged a little bit about I think it was to do with the anger levels and things like that with John Lang and when to sort of turn it up and turn it down and stuff. There's some interesting little insight there about the sort of feedback process.
Ted was also nominated for an Emmy for Anatomy of a Homicide, Life on the Street, for outstanding informational or cultural programming. So not only was the episode Emmy nominated, the documentary we just finished talking about was also Emmy nominated. So it's really worth a watch, people. And at this point, unfortunately, and Ted mentions this during our conversation, it's available on YouTube, but it's illegally on YouTube because he owns it. Originally, when it was broadcast on PBS, it had the entire documentary and then the entire episode in the middle without commercials, which I would have loved to have seen that all together. Right now, if you watch it on YouTube, it does not have the episode in it. It just says you can watch this episode on the DVD package or something.
Yeah. It's on the Homicide Season 6 DVD, the American release. I can't speak for the European release. I've got the American box set because it was always better for extras. And it's on the Season 6 box set.
And it has the episode embedded in it on the DVD?
No, I don't believe it does. No. I think the episode's separate, I believe.
Because then Ted said PBS showed it with it embedded. But then PBS...
Yeah, probably during the broadcast. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But then PBS, you can't find it on PBS now because PBS doesn't own it. It's Ted who wrote, directed, and produced it. It's his property.
Yeah, so Ted needs to speak to Peacock or
Peacock once again
release it on DVD and Blu-ray separately.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Wouldn't that be great? Yeah, it needs to be. The whole piece needs to be streaming. And why wouldn't it be on Peacock? Because it's an NBC concern.
Yeah. As a documentary about the process of making film and TV, it's so educational, and hence why Ted uses it in his classes. And I think if anybody's interested in how TV and film's made, it just shows you the kind of the balance between artistic and kind of the kind of business side of the TV process. Like there's a really funny it is funny, probably wasn't at the time, but where Jim Yoshimura's on the phone with NBC about how many swear words and different variations they can use. And so you can't say like crap and what was the other word now? It was a variation of the
dump.
word crap.
Did they put dump in instead
you
of
can't
crap?
have a dump and a crap. You can only have one or the other, and it's stuff like that. So
and that they could use the word bastard, which I was surprised back in the 90s they could do that on network television.
Yeah. And it was also interesting, like with Teddy's philosophy when doing the documentary. So when you're behind the scenes on a film set, I've shot behind the scenes of one film, and you have to be a little bit bold because if you go around trying to get permission for everybody to film stuff, everybody will just keep saying no to you because you're like, oh, we don't want you there because it might do this. So you kind of have to kind of go out there and just get on with it until somebody tells you off. So Teddy put it as he had to ask for forgiveness and not seek permission when filming. And that's the only way they managed to kind of get everything that they wanted to get. Like, for example, the very famous conversation between Jim Yoshimura and Gary Fleeter about Alex, and about how Gary was sort of kind of driving Alex a little bit up the wall, I think was the term that was used, because I think Gary was talking 2 shots ahead or something and not talking about the very shot that they were doing, which I've been on the receiving end of that when I was doing low budget music videos where I used to work with a director who was talking about the 5th shot on when we're still dealing with the current shot that we're doing. And it gets very confusing very fast when that happens.
Right. It was such a I don't want to say by the seat of your pants cinematography, but because everything was always moving, there was always the opportunity to move or change the shot while you're in the middle of it. Now, this was a little different because this was a much more confined space. There was a lot of butt dolly use when they were in between Vince D'Onofrio and Andre and the EMT. Teddy talked about it being like a triangle of how, they kept going back and forth. But to have worked out what they're going to do, and what I understand is then, and Gary, you can email us and tell us if this isn't true, but Gary would come up and tap Alex on the shoulder and want to change the shot while he was shooting it, which is, it was a stressful situation. And of course, Gary was stressed too because it was a stressful situation.
Well, his only time directing on the show. I mean, being a guest director must be incredibly intense. And also that shooting style was not natural to a lot of directors who came in on the show because it was very unique to Homicide. And I think that was the challenge. Gary was trying to do kind of almost classic cinema a little bit, whilst Homicide is this sort of verite thing. And I must admit, I do wonder sometimes why they brought in a guest director for such a bold episode of the show. I wondered, it struck me, I wonder why they didn't work with somebody who'd been on the show a few times before, who knew the way Homicide worked. I wasn't sure what the logic behind that was, but that's a way above my pay grade. Because imagine if Jean directed that episode or something.
Right. I've also wondered about the maybe it was something about his feature. His feature was it Kiss the Girls with
Kiss
Morgan
the Girls.
Freeman?
Yeah.
Maybe there was
Freeman,
something in that made him. I don't know, but I've often wondered, and this would be either a Tom or a Barry question, or a Tom and Barry question. The idea that they purposefully chose feature film directors to be literally thrown into the fire. I mean, very few feature films are shot the way this was shot. The only director and camera person that had done that kind of film was Nick and John with Laws of Gravity. So was the idea bringing in feature film directors who have, obviously, if they're also experienced feature film directors, may have a built-in style, may be known, like De Palma. We didn't have De Palma, but think Brian De Palma. He had a very visual style, distinct visual style. So you're bringing in feature film people who may already have their own distinct visual style.
Yeah, and experience maybe with the set piece. That might be what drove the decision, because obviously it's a big stunt that the whole thing's based around.
Right. Yeah, and who knows? And then they're thrown into this very specific situation. That old it's like that old adage: the hardest steel goes through the hottest flame.
Yeah.
Into a crew that all know their own, that know that you are, as Andre says in the documentary, we accept them as visiting guests for a week, or whatever he says, and with a really snarky smile on his face. So not just is the style of the way the film is, the way Homicide was shot is different.
We're coming into it from a traditionally shot movie, or a movie of bigger resources, because you're going in. It's a bit like, I've always likened filmmaking, it's a bit like various degrees of camping or going on holidays. When you do a big Marvel thing, it's like being in a 5-star hotel where you can call up room service, whilst on a low budget film, it's like camping and you've got to take everything with you. Anything you leave behind, good luck. So Homicide's probably maybe a 1-star hotel on this on this scale, where you've got maybe a little bit of room service, but nothing much.
But also, the films they worked on, that was their film crew. It was their cameraman or camerawoman. It was their film crew, their crew, and they come in, and it is not their crew. This is not your crew. This is people that have been doing this for years, and you're coming in as the invited, alien
guest,
invited guest. So who knows what kind of pressure Gary was under, for sure.
Oh, he must have been under very intense pressure, I think. Because I think this is the one thing. This maybe we need to get some more directors on. I think it's not easy directing anything, to be honest, and coming into something that's super established, and then they want you to mix it up a bit. And then, from what we understand from some of the stories we've heard, the cast weren't always receptive to some of those suggestions, and so it must be very intimidating. And I guess you've got to kind of find this sort of careful balance, which I think that's why there were some directors who kept coming back, because they found the right formula of being bold. So Peter Medak, I noticed his style was very visual, and sometimes even didn't necessarily go out of Homicide, but there was certain shots that just felt like creeping dolly shots more, that I didn't remember so much being the Homicide style. So he definitely found this careful way of imprinting a visual sensibility to things that were a bit different to what Homicide usually did. So
Right.
yeah.
And I think about other episodic TV that I worked on. We had different directors as well. It wasn't the same director every week. But let's just use the old Saw. So on Murder, She Wrote, if you come in as a director on Murder, She Wrote, how are we shooting it? We're shooting it like you shoot a feature film. Obviously, we're shooting it faster, and there are corners cut, and the budget's lower. But literally, the way the shots are set up, We go through the whole blocking. Everybody gets marks. We do the same, we rehearse it. We shoot it the same way we rehearsed it. Wide shot, over, close up. Very, very traditional filmmaking. So if you come in as a director on a show like that, what are you more worried about? You're less worried about what the hell is going on with the camera and how are we blocking the scene, and you're worried more about the performance and the actors. So you come into Homicide, and there's a whole many other layers of things that you have to keep that you're keeping an eye on, or that you want to have imprint your style on. That's a different experience from feature filmmaking or traditional television, network television filmmaking.
Yeah. One other thing back to Teddy, it was quite interesting how he didn't really know what they got until the end of each day, and would watch the tapes, or the rushes, or the dailies, as I think you call them in the States, on videotape after the fact. And he was worried for a few days that he had a bit of a mess, because the first day of filming was just lots of extras running around and kind of chaos around the stunt. And it wasn't until the stunt was accomplished that he felt that the documentary had found a rhythm, and also that the episode had found a rhythm too. So it was quite interesting.
I thought that the quote at the beginning of the documentary, I love that quote. This is a story of risk, ambition, and creativity under pressure. That's a great little distillation of just filmmaking in general, but for sure is about Homicide. Every aspect of it, from pre-production to post-production. The other quote I really liked that Ted brought up was about the difference between documentary filmmaking and dramatic or fictional filmmaking. And he said he'd been listening to NPR, and an Irish author, I wish he'd said which Irish author, I wonder which one it was. It was Colin McCann or one of those guys, who quoted Gabriel Garcia Marquez as saying, "In journalism, just one fact that is false prejudices the entire work. In contrast, in fiction, one single fact that is true legitimizes the entire work." I love that. That is also a great quote, and really makes you think about, how many dramatic films have you seen that say based on a true story, or based on somebody's memories, or so there's some element of truth in it, but obviously a lot of it has been fictionalized. But you don't want your documentary to veer from that quest for the truth at all. And then I loved the conversation Richard had, talking about not just about reality television and how it really flummoxes the idea of documentary filmmaking, because it is not documentary filmmaking. And then how it has influenced people, just the whole media accessibility and all the smartphones and people taking selfies of themselves all the time, and, having podcasts and posting things about themselves, that they go to interview people or go talk to people, and they have been influenced by the media culture, and they want to project a certain persona that is not really the best way to capture somebody's persona. You want to try to disarm them and capture them, in their relaxed, real person state, not in some state they've worked up to present themselves in. So this just really lots of interesting aspects about documentary filmmaking that this conversation was just terrific to touch on.
I think that's a good place to sort of wrap up on. Is there anything else you want to add? Or
I'm going to wrap up on what Teddy said toward the end. I think I asked him about the fact that I really felt like his interest and passion for the show came through in the documentary. And he said documentary filmmaking is a magical process. And if you mean it, the meaning comes shining through. And it does in this documentary. And I'd really encourage everybody who's a Homicide fan to watch the documentary. And if you're not a Homicide fan yet, watch that and then start watching the show, because it really gives a great grounding background to the production.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for listening out there. Thank you very much for your support, and I hope you enjoy our forthcoming episodes coming up in our second year. So thank you very much for your support. Take care, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Yes.
Bye for now.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, everyone.